Delaware any minute now ahead of a closed-door national security meeting alongside Vice President Harris. It comes as Iran issues a chilling threat as Hezbollah says they launched a drone attack against Israel, previewing a possible larger attack and all-out war. Hello, I'm John Roberts in Washington, and guess who we welcome in Washington today?
Thanks for having me here.
Great to see you.
It's good to be back in the studio here in Washington. Good to be with you. All right, John, I'm Sandra Smith in Washington. This is America Reports. Israel's defense minister is visiting a command center with the Israeli Air Force. It's happening today. They're briefing them on air defense capabilities in that region. The U.S. deployed ships and fighter jets to the Middle East. As Axios is reporting, Secretary of State Antony Blinken warned G7 allies an Iranian attack could happen as soon as today.
Fox team coverage for you now. Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg and the threat of a widening war.
All right, but first let's get right to Alex Hogan. She is live on the ground in Tel Aviv, Israel, for us at this hour. What do we know, Alex?
Hi, John and Sandra. So we've been hearing sirens in the northern part of the country as well as the southern part of the country as Israel fields attacks from both Hamas and Hezbollah. But it is really bracing for what could be a potential Iranian attack, one that Iran says will happen.
The Islamic Republic of Iran will definitely take serious and deterrent action with strength, determination and firmness in ensuring its security and punishing the aggressor.
Well, today, Israel's defense minister visited troops, briefing them on air defense capabilities in different areas and how to quickly switch gears to fight back. Now, at the same time, Israel is leaning on its allies, hoping that that same coalition will come to its aid like it did in April when Iran launched more than 300 drones and missiles toward Israel in one night alone. Well, as the U.S. is bolstering its military footprint in the region to support Israel's defense, today, U.S. General Michael Kurilla is here in Israel. He's meeting with the chief of the general staff of Israel, talking security and strategy. Now, meanwhile, in Gaza today, Hamas militants fired about 15 rockets from the southern part of the Strip onto Israeli territory. But over the weekend, more than 40 Palestinians were killed in Israeli airstrikes on schools and one on a hospital, areas that the IDF claims were being used as command centers and weapons manufacturing spaces. Now, there's also new violence today along Israel's border with Lebanon. The IDF says it took out a Hezbollah weapons storage facility after what has been days of really escalating tensions that we have watched, and countries around the world are sounding the alarm and urging their citizens to leave Lebanon. So we've seen airports in Beirut continue to pack up as people are trying to get on whatever flight they possibly can out of the country as quickly as possible. New tension tonight also with Iran warning other airlines to not fly over its airspace. John, Sandra.
All right, Alex Hogan there in Tel Aviv for us. Alex, thank you.
All right, let's bring in Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, Fox News contributor and former national security advisor. So I thought this was interesting, and I want to get your interpretation. Competing headlines in one news publication, The Times of Israel. One headline says, Iran said to dismiss U.S. Arab calls for restraint, even if it sparks war. The competing headline, Iran claims it does not want to escalate regional tensions, but must punish Israel. Which one is it?
Yeah, John Sandra, thanks for having me today. Look, this is really interesting as you watch this, and because what Israel may have done is Israel may have set a level of deterrence that we haven't seen in the Middle East for a long time. Here's what I mean by it. Let me connect the dots. What they did recently by going downtown in Tehran and killing the leader of Hamas, Haniyeh, was amazing. Then they killed Shukr, the #2 guy in Hezbollah. Then they went down 2 weeks ago, after losing one Israeli, they went down and virtually destroyed all of the Houthis' infrastructure down in Yemen. Recently, when the Iranians attacked, what they did is using the Iron Dome of the air would prevent major damage. They went back and attacked Natanz. Say the Israelis took out all the air defense sites around Natanz, which is one of their top nuclear sites. And it's shown that Israel can really reach out and touch you. So the Supreme Leader of Iran's got a problem. He has recently lost Raisi, his president, an old confidant. Ismail Ghani, who's the leader of the Quds Force, is not very good, and because they lost Soleimani years ago. So now the Supreme Leader is going, do I really want to risk this by going all in, knowing that Israel has been willing to respond using complex military operations, which they've done, like going into Yemen, or do I just want to give a pinprick and say, okay, I'm over and done with? And so he's got a big dilemma, because I really think if he comes back hard on Israel, it's game over. They are going to go after them all the way downtown to Tehran. And if I was Israel, I'd say, Supreme Leader, you're at risk. Your nuclear facilities at risk. You know we can reach out and touch and we'll go there. Or is he going to step back and say, they've shown a level of strength. Maybe I don't want to go there. So that's why you're seeing the conflicting signals. I don't think that they've made a decision. Yeah. But either way, I would not bet against Israel at all, because they've got the capacity, the capability, more than anything.
Well, we wonder which way Iran is leaning at this hour, as we do put up the scoop in Axios on the screen as far as the timing of an attack. Blinken apparently told the G7 Iran and Hezbollah could attack Israel in the next 24 hours, which is putting the world on alert. Blinken convened the conference call to coordinate with close U.S. allies and try to generate last-minute diplomatic pressure on Iran and Hezbollah to minimize their retaliation as much as possible, General. He stressed that limiting the impact of their strikes is the best chance to prevent all-out war. It seems all-out preparations are being made for whatever could be happening.
And the real person that makes this decision is the Supreme Leader of Iran. Where does he want to go? And I think he's having second thoughts, because what Israel has done, and something we have not done, they've put respect and fear into Iran. And so I think he's got a big problem right now. And I'm kind of hoping, cautiously optimistic, that they're going to kind of do a pinprick like they did with us after we killed Soleimani. They went after Al-Assad Air Base, but they hit dirt. And we had some people injured, but only through basically concussions, because they told us in advance, well, we've got to respond, but it's going to respond in this way. Because I think he knows if he responds heavy, if they kill a single Israeli, they've got a major problem on their hands.
I would think, if they throw a rocket or a missile into downtown Tel Aviv or Haifa or maybe the western part of Jerusalem, it's going to be a big problem. We had up on the screen there, maybe we can put it back, the U.S. force posture in the region. Do you think that will act as a deterrent, or will that simply serve to help defend Israel if Iran and Hezbollah decide that they're going to launch?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference, even though we've got the Teddy Roosevelt aircraft carrier battle group there. And here's why. If you've got military force, I don't care how good the military force is, if you have got the will to use it and the backbone to use it, then it doesn't mean anything. Their fear is not the United States. Their fear is Israel willing to go all out. And Israel has shown recently in what they have done in the killing of Hamas and Hezbollah leadership that they're willing to go there. And that is what's preying on the mind of the Supreme Leader.
General Kellogg, good to see you in person. Thank you.
Thank you. We wait and see. Hopefully we won't be going there, though. All right. Speaking of things that we're watching closely, live look at the Dow as the market officially opened this morning after a weekend of uncertainty, down 958 points now. Oh, look at that. The NASDAQ and the S&P are also way down as well. Fears of a U.S. recession triggering a global sell-off, which just happens to come a few days after the market hit almost record territory because of the anticipation maybe of a rate cut. Fox Business correspondent Kelly O'Grady live with more. Kelly, is this just a temporary blip, or is this something more permanent?
Well, that's the question, John, right? There's a lot of uncertainty, a lot of questions regarding, are we entering a recession, or is this more of a market correction we're seeing? So just to orient you where we are right now, I've got it in front of me, down 923 for the Dow, S&P down 136, and the NASDAQ down 496. Now, that is well off session lows, but a big driver of this activity we're seeing today is the jobs report from last week. Now, unemployment ticked up to 4.3%. In addition to adding an anemic 114,000 jobs. Now, that 4.3%, it triggers what's known as the SOM rule. Without getting bogged down into the details, the SOM rule has been accurate in defining every recession since the early 70s. Another metric we're watching, Goldman Sachs just upgraded their risk of a recession from 15 to 25%. Now, I will note they still see the risk is limited, but it does underscore the concern from economists is escalating. Back to the market, the big tech sector is getting really hard hit today. NVIDIA is down close to 6%. One light of thought here, right, is these names were beneficiaries of big inflows with the AI hype. A lot of folks I'm talking to are saying the sell-off is more of a correction, right? These valuations were already too big, and so we're seeing some profit taking. Another line of thought, though, is that if we are indeed approaching a recession, you move away from the growth stocks. Now, zooming out, the sell-off, it's not just happening here in the U.S. Global markets are reeling as well. The Japanese Nikkei closed down over 12%. That was the worst day for that index since 1987. And if you're a cryptocurrency junkie like me, that space shed over $500 billion in the last 24 hours. So yes, John, investors are concerned. There's a flight to safer assets that we're seeing, but we're well off session lows rather. So I think it's too early to determine if this recession fear is real. We'll see how the week goes.
All right. And the day is still long. Appreciate it. Thank you. Sandra?
Yeah, we'll have another update on the market shortly. Meantime, coming up, my exclusive sit down with Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch in a rare interview at the Supreme Court. In a wide-ranging interview, we talk the state of the Republic, his new book, Overruled: The Human Toll of Too Much Law, and his response to recent calls for sweeping reforms to the Supreme Court. Here is some of that interview from earlier today when I asked him about presidential immunity. Obviously, this is all happening you're writing this book during a crucial time for the Supreme Court. I'm sure you're probably enjoying a little break. But some major decisions came down, of which you were part of the presidential immunity ruling. I wonder if any message you can share with us on the unprecedented nature of the court handling something like that.
Well, you gave us a very hard question, right? It's the first time in American history that one presidential administration was seeking to bring criminal charges against a predecessor. And we had to go back and look at what sources were available to us. And there's certain things we can agree on, right? You can impeach a president if he does something unlawful. You can enjoin or stop the conduct of his officials. You can go to court and get an injunction. Those are two things we can all agree on. We also agree that no man is above the law in his private conduct. Even a president can be prosecuted for speeding, okay? His private conduct, he's like everyone else. What happens, though, when he leaves office? Well, there's a precedent in the United States Supreme Court called Nixon versus Fitzgerald, in which the court said that civil cases can't be brought against a president presumptively in his official capacity after he leaves office. Why? Because that would chill him from exercising the powers and duties of president while he's president. He'd be overwhelmed. His political enemies would simply bring suits against him forevermore. And so the court held that about 50 years ago. And all the court did in this case was simply apply that same precedent and idea to the criminal context.
Grateful to the justice for the sit down earlier today. We hit on a whole lot more. Obviously, that was a big moment to hear the Supreme Court justice weigh in on the presidential immunity ruling. A lot more from that interview coming up, as he just wrote this book. It's called Overruled. And it's really interesting. His passion is to dig into what he says is the human toll of too much law. Oftentimes we talk, John, about the economic toll of too much regulation, about too much law in this country. And this is about the human toll. And in a bit, he'll dig into this story about a fisherman and his wife down in Florida, and a lawsuit that changed their life forever. And Justice Gorsuch gives us that story in his own words in just a bit. And it's a remarkable telling of everyday Americans who are suffering from too much law.
You know, aside from reading the entire decision by the Supreme Court on immunity, that's the most I've heard any Supreme Court justice talk about.
Yeah, agreed. And there's more on that coming up.
All right, looking forward to that.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
We're awaiting today's State Department briefing as the U.S. monitors an anticipated Iranian attack against Israel. Live coverage just as soon as that briefing kicks off.
All right, Debbie is bearing down in Florida, bringing devastating flooding and storm surge to its Gulf Coast.
This storm has produced and will likely produce significant flooding events. When you have flood situations, that is the number one way where we will see fatalities.
Here today, I sat down with Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch in a rare interview at the Supreme Court. I asked him about his new book, Overruled, in which he writes about the human toll of too much law. Justice Gorsuch, thank you very much for having us here today.
Good morning. It's great to be with you.
It's a pleasure to be here. Your new book, Overruled, it tells the stories of everyday Americans and how the sheer volume and complexity of our laws and our legal system are taking over the lives of everyday people. What are we doing about it? And why did you feel compelled to write and tell their stories?
So I've been a judge now for about 18 years, and I just kept seeing cases where ordinary, decent, hardworking Americans found themselves being swallowed up by law that they didn't see coming and that they couldn't have anticipated, and their lives were ruined. Who've also done some wonderful things to try and address it too. But people like John and Sandra Yates, fishermen in Florida, Marty Hahn, a magician in Missouri, the Hemingway Museum in Florida, Bobby Unser in Colorado. And I just thought it was important to explore what's going on in our law. What has happened in my lifetime that's changed in our law? And it turns out quite a lot. The number of laws has just simply exploded. That's the short answer. The little longer answer is, you're probably a federal criminal, Sandra. Some of my friends in the Academy estimate that Americans commit, every one of us over the age of 18 could be tried for a federal crime. The Federal Criminal Code has more than doubled in my lifetime. Federal regulations, the Federal Register used to be 16 pages when it was first produced in the 1930s. It now runs over 60 to 70,000 new pages every single year.
How can anybody keep up with that?
Well, and that's my question for the book. And what should we as Americans do about it? What can we do about it? Because one old judge in Washington can't address the problem. It's a problem for we the people.
There's a common theme, having read both your books now that you've written during your term here at the Supreme Court. You write about a profound decline in trust in one another. And perhaps this is the result of that. How did we get here? And what is your message about the state of the country today? Considering your writings in your first book, A Republic, If You Can Keep It, how are we doing?
Yeah, so I think the Declaration has three really profound statements to us, right, that have resonated through history. We all have inalienable rights. We're all created equal, and we have the right to govern ourselves. That's kind of our report card, our national report card. And I do think it's worth asking, how are we doing on those fronts today? That's kind of what the book seeks to explore. And I'm really grateful that I had a chance to do it.
You're labeled a conservative justice. This is a conservative court. To those Americans who question what is happening with this institution today, you tell them what?
Well, first of all, the book is not conservative or liberal. It's a question for all Americans. You know, what do we say when we have so many regulations that people like John and Sandra Yates are caught up in it?
The fisherman,
and his wife. What do we say when 1 out of 47 Americans is now subject to some form of correctional supervision in this country? When there are more people serving life sentences today than in 1970 were serving any sentence. Okay, now you ask about the court.
Sure.
Fine. Well, I think the court's doing a pretty good job, I'll be honest with you, Sandra. You ask us to decide the 70 hardest cases in the country every year. Cases where the lower courts have disagreed. And there are 9 of us. Can you get 9 of your colleagues to agree on where to go to lunch? Right?
Nope.
And we've been appointed by 5 different presidents over 30 years. And we are able to reach a unanimous judgment in these hard cases about 40% of the time. Do you hear that? Now, that's the same figure as it was in about 1945 when Franklin Roosevelt had appointed 8 of the 9 justices of the Supreme Court. Okay, now you say, well, what about those divided cases, those 6-3s? Fine. Well, the 6-3s this term, only about half of them are the ones you're thinking about. The others are more scrambled groupings. According to the New York Times last term, in 45% of ideologically divided cases, whatever that means, I agreed with what the Times called the liberal result. That's the court I know. And that those, quote, ideological cases, 6-3, it's about a third of our docket this last year. And again, that's about the same number as it was in 1945. So really, my experience at this court is nothing changes.
Which brings me back to so many of these incredible stories that you tell in the book about hair breeders, a magician who wanted to use a bunny in his show. I mean, this is a world that might be unrecognizable to many not too long ago.
So has our judicial system gotten too far? Can we rein it back? Can we bring these laws back? I mean, how do we save everyday Americans from getting mired down in the judicial system? Many are for years, and they lose their nest eggs fighting these battles.
Well, let's take Isis Brantley, the hair braider.
Sure.
So an ancient art handed down to her and her family, uses her hands. One day her salon, she's pretty successful, doing well, is raided and shut down. Why? Because she didn't have a barber license.
Wow.
Now she says, I don't want to cut hair. I don't use knives or scissors or anything like that. I just use my hands. They say, well, you have to go to barber school. It takes 3 years to go to barber school. A lot of money. She didn't have, right? And of course, at barber school, how much do they teach you about hair braiding?
Not much.
Nothing. It turns out nothing is the answer. She loses her home. She's homeless for a period.
Yeah.
She fights, though, Sandra, okay? And she wins the right to hair braid. She overcomes the Texas licensing system and wins. So I know we have problems, but I'm an optimist when I see people like Isis Brantley standing up for what they know to be right.
Really enjoyed the conversation with the justice, and also, John, next hour, I'll have more from that sit down, including his thoughts on recent calls by the president himself for sweeping reforms to the Supreme Court.
That was really fascinating. So we know that the magician in Missouri had an illegal bunny. The hair braider didn't have a barber's license. What was the other John and Sandra's problem?
The fisherman down in Florida. So his wife got a knock on the door one day. She's doing laundry. He tells this story later, and he was brought into court 3 years after a federal official boarded his boat, measured his fish, found that a few of them didn't make the required size, threw them back, said, come to shore, I'll deal with this later. And he was accused of switching the fish. And anyway, it was an incredible case that went a very, very long time that they ended up winning in the Supreme Court. His wife said, we're not giving in. We're standing up for what is right. We don't want this to happen to other Americans.
And then the other question I have, I know that you probably never fish switched in your life. Well, maybe, I don't know, because you do go fishing from time to time. What are you guilty of?
None of mine are long enough.
Yes, the judge said you probably committed some federal crime.
Well, that's part of the problem. He said sometimes you're brought into court, the law changes to where right now you wouldn't be guilty of that crime, but because they look back 4, 5, 10 years in some of these cases. I mean, it was an incredible conversation and eye-opening for me, someone who's not deep into the law, to find out what's really happening out there. And this is, to his point, happening to everyday Americans. And so often we're covering the economic toll. He's talking about the human toll, these real-world stories of everyday Americans who are paying the ultimate price. And so many of them, they feel like they just want to take this all the way to the Supreme Court because they know and believe that they are right, John.
No, he's a fascinating fella. I like his hair, too.
Indeed. And it is always a privilege and an honor to be there at the Supreme Court and walk the halls. It is one of our greatest institutions, for sure.
Yeah, well, we need to remind people of that because there's a segment of society that's trying to run the court down.
I appreciate you saying that. We ask him about that. We will have that from the interview next hour.
All right, looking forward to that. The U.S. economy setting off alarms on Wall Street and around the world. Charlie Gasparina tells us why stocks are tumbling and whether the U.S. is indeed headed for a recession.
Plus, Debbie drenching Florida as the tropical storm heads north. We are live in northern Florida next.
The State Department briefing right now as we await President Biden's Situation Room meeting with top national security officials on the growing crisis in the Middle East. The U.S. says it is prepared for every scenario as an Iranian attack on Israel appears imminent following the deaths of top officials within Hamas and Hezbollah last week.
Okay. It's Hurricane Debbie. It is now a tropical storm blasting across Florida. At least 4 people are now dead, and other states are now bracing for impact later this week. Nicole Valdez is reporting for Fox Weather live in Madison, Florida for us. Is the state ready to respond to the damage after this storm moves on, Nicole?
Sandra, Governor Ron DeSantis believes so. He says he has been working for the last few days to prepare Floridians for the impacts of now Tropical Storm Debbie. Again, not a storm that can really compare to one that hit this same area about a year ago, Hurricane Idalia back then, but still one that has already packed a punch. Flooding already taking place across the Sunshine State. Right here in Madison, we're just east of the state capital of Tallahassee, and we've seen some lower-lying local roads already underwater. That's just to name a few. The flooding started really yesterday across the Gulf Coast of Florida and will continue over the next few days. The governor says that he has been in touch with the National Guard, who has already stationed more than 3,000 soldiers to be ready to respond to the impacts, as well as more than 17,000 linemen to try to get power back up and running. Right now, we know that power is out for more than 300,000 across the state. The hope is that they won't have to wait days to see the lights come back on after this impactful storm. Sandra.
Wow. We're just taking in all the sights we are seeing there, and we wish the very best for all those affected by this. Thank you so much, Nicole. John?
Everything from big tech to consumer stocks getting hit hard today as investors run for the hills amid growing signs of a recession. There's the Dow. It's down a little more than 900, not as bad as it was earlier in the day, and hopefully not as good as it will be later in the day. Charlie Gasparino can tell us what is driving the steep nosedive. Charlie, you know, I can never figure out the stock market because on July the 26th, an email went around here at Fox that said stocks soar on rate cut bets, and today stocks tumble on recession fears. Which is it?
And rate cuts coming. They're tumbling on the rate cuts coming, which they are coming. Listen, I think, you know, at some point, you know, you could talk about rate cuts, you could talk about this, talk about that. Stocks trade on fundamentals in the long term. The fundamentals are now looking increasingly not good. And one reason why is because the corporate economy is essentially, and the Wall Street economy is catching up with essentially the Main Street economy. For 4 years, particularly the last 2 years, we've had fairly significant inflation. Inflation to the point that when people were working, they felt like they needed to work more, and they were in a horrible mood about it, or else Joe Biden's, you know, approval numbers would be a lot higher. And they're not. We've had an economic problem. No matter how many times you try to paper it over, try to spin it with transitory inflation, everything's going great. Main Street didn't feel that great. But everything was okay on Wall Street. People were buying stocks for a lot of reasons. Now, finally, the Main Street economy is catching up with Wall Street because there is clear evidence now that the consumer is cutting back. The employment outlook is looking weaker. There's less employment. It's a softer job market. I mean, all the sort of factors you need for an economy is kicking in. And I will say this one thing. I don't want to make this totally political, but I guarantee this is in people's minds. The fact that Donald Trump is now losing marginally or you know, neck and neck with Kamala Harris, and which would be a continuation of the Biden economic policies, is clearly playing some role. If she replicates what Joe Biden wants to do, we're talking about, you know, more regulations, taxes, you know, go down the line, stuff that's not good for the economy or hasn't worked. We should point out, without being biased here, hasn't worked for the last 4 years, really, when you think about it.
Well, jury's out on that. We'll see.
Jury's out on that. It's right there. It's right on your screen.
Well, the stock market
you mentioned it earlier, right?
Yeah. So I did. I sat down. I talked to John a bit when I got here, and we were looking at the stock market. And I've shared with you, you know, sort of the betting odds on the lead to win the White House. And the stock market, as it was going up, was tracking the higher probability that Trump was going to win back the White House. And so it's interesting to note that as she sort of gains in enthusiasm and gains in the polls, that the stock market's sort of selling off. That it's merely an observation, and market watchers have to watch everything. And that's certainly part of the equation. Now, when it comes to the stock market, oftentimes, hold on, it's a lagging indicator. And I'm just wondering what the stock market saw earlier, right? What they're factoring in the future.
Well, wait a second. It's not necessarily a lagging indicator. I mean, look, there was clearly a Trump trade that was put on when it looked like he was going to run away with it against sleepy Joe Biden, so to speak. You know what I'm saying? No doubt. Trump trade put on certain stocks, financials, energy stocks, going through the roof. It was powering the market. That trade definitely reversed when Biden dropped out, Kamala Harris got in there, and there was this effusive sort of push by the mainstream media, and her poll numbers went up, and the predicted odds got even, or Kamala Harris a little ahead. There's no doubt that has